The handcuffs clicked shut before anyone had time to react. 1 second she was standing there, calm, still, her hands open at her sides, and the next, Officer Derek Slade had yanked her wrists behind her back and snapped the metal tight like he was catching a fugitive. Like she was dangerous. Like she was nothing. The crowd on the steps of the Harmon County Civic Center froze. 300 people had gathered for the annual Community Achievement Ceremony. A celebration, a proud afternoon, balloons tied to iron railings and children sitting on their fathers' shoulders. And now every single one of them was staring at a black woman in a navy blue dress being forced to her knees on the marble steps. Her name was Dr. Maya Ellison, but Officer Slade didn't know that. Or maybe he didn't care. "Stop resisting," Slade barked. Loud enough for the cameras, loud enough for the crowd. Except she wasn't resisting. She hadn't moved. She was standing exactly where she had been standing for the past 4 minutes, waiting to enter the building where she had been invited as an honored guest. A woman near the back of the crowd gasped. A child started crying. 3 phones went up instantly, then 10, then 30. But Officer Slade wasn't paying attention to any of that. He was leaning down toward her ear, his voice dropping just low enough that the cameras wouldn't catch it clearly. "You people always want to make a scene," he said. Those words, right there, in front of hundreds of witnesses and a dozen rolling cameras. And yet somehow Derek Slade's hand was steady. His jaw was firm. His eyes didn't flicker with doubt for even half a second. This was a man completely convinced that nothing he did here would ever cost him anything. He had done this before. You could see it in the practiced ease of his movements. The way he filled out the small notepad without even looking at it. The way he spoke to his radio with the casual boredom of someone ordering lunch. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He was comfortable, dangerously, completely comfortable. Maya said nothing. She kept her eyes forward. Her breathing was controlled. Her spine was straight. And the strangest thing, the thing that made the crowd go absolutely quiet, was the look on her face. She wasn't humiliated. She wasn't broken. She wasn't even surprised. She looked like a woman who had just realized something important. Something she had suspected for a long time but had never been handed this clearly, this publicly, this perfectly preserved on video. She looked like a woman who had just been handed everything she needed. But nobody in that crowd knew why. Not yet. Because there was something about Dr. Maya Ellison that Officer Derek Slade had just made the single biggest mistake of his career by not bothering to find out. And in about 72 hours, the entire state would know what it was. People who knew Maya Ellison in the early years described her the same way. Quiet, reserved. The kind of person you could overlook in a room if you weren't paying attention. Which, as it turned out, was exactly what made her so dangerous to the people who eventually tried to destroy her. She had grown up in Kellerton, a small town in the southeastern part of the state where the schools were underfunded and the options were limited and the message delivered daily. In small, quiet ways that cut deeper than any raised voice ever could, was that some people simply mattered less than others. Maya had heard that message loud and clear. She had just decided, somewhere around the age of 10, not to believe it. She worked. While other kids in her neighborhood were told college wasn't realistic, Maya was at the library until closing time every single night. While doors closed in front of her, and they did close repeatedly, sometimes politely and sometimes not, she found other doors or built them herself. She graduated top of her class. Then she did it again at university. Then again at graduate school. By 32, she had a doctorate in public health policy. By 37, she was running a nonprofit called the Ellison Foundation, which had quietly, very quietly, spent a decade and a half documenting patterns of misconduct, discrimination, and policy failure in law enforcement across the state. Not with protests, not with press conferences, with data, with affidavits, with sealed court records that her legal team had spent years prying open one careful motion at a time. Maya didn't believe in noise for its own sake. She believed in evidence. She believed in patience. She believed in building a case so airtight that when the moment finally came, no one could argue their way out of it. She had been building that case for 15 years. The community knew her as the woman who ran free health clinics on the East Side. The woman who had quietly secured $3 million in grants for Kellerton School District. The woman who showed up at county meetings and asked careful, specific questions that somehow always made the officials in the room look deeply uncomfortable. What they didn't know, what Derek Slade certainly didn't know, was what she had been building behind those careful questions. What lived in those locked filing cabinets in her foundation's offices on 5th Street. And now, as she sat in the back of a police cruiser with her wrists in cuffs, staring out the window at the crowd still standing stunned on those civic center steps, one thought moved through her mind with absolute clarity. The moment she had spent 15 years preparing for had just begun. But what had she been preparing for exactly, and how deep did the thing she had uncovered actually go? By the time the cruiser reached the precinct, Derek Slade had already called his supervisor. Not to report what happened, to get ahead of it. This was the move of a man with practice. A man who understood how the machinery worked and how to grease it in his favor before anyone else got their hands near the controls. His supervisor was Captain Alan Forsyth, a man who had been quietly protecting Derek Slade from consequences for the better part of 7 years. At the station, they processed Maya with deliberate slowness. Every bureaucratic delay that could be invented was invented. The intake form filled out wrong and redone. The phone call she was entitled to mysteriously not available for 40 minutes. Her personal items placed in a bag, logged incorrectly, then relogged. It was a system of humiliation disguised as procedure, every minute inside that room designed to make her feel smaller, more powerless, more forgotten. Slade appeared in the doorway of the processing room with a paper coffee cup in his hand and watched. "You want to tell me what you were actually doing there?" he said. Maya looked at him evenly. "I was invited." Invited. He repeated the word like it was funny, like it was something she'd made up. "By who?" "The governor's office," she said. There was a pause. Just one beat. Slade's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Something fast and instinctive that he covered immediately with a slow, disbelieving smile. "Sure," he said, and walked away. Outside, the video was already moving. 3 separate recordings from 3 different angles were spreading across every platform in real time, and the comment sections were detonating. A prominent civil rights attorney posted the clip with 2 words, "Name him." Within an hour, Derek Slade's precinct number was identified. Within 90 minutes, his personnel photo was circulating online. The crowd at the Civic Center hadn't left. If anything, it had grown. People who had heard about the arrest from their phones had come back, or come for the first time, standing in the afternoon heat with signs they had made from cardboard and markers they'd run home to find. The ceremony inside had been quietly canceled. The organizers didn't know what else to do. Mayor Patricia Dunn issued a statement that managed to say nothing in 4 complete paragraphs. It used phrases like gathering facts and due process and context matters. The language of officials who have decided that waiting is safer than standing for something. The statement was screenshot and ridiculed within minutes. Then, at 6:47 in the evening, something happened that nobody expected. The police union issued a statement defending Officer Slade. They called the arrest by the book. They called the footage misleading without context. They described Derek Slade as a decorated officer with an exemplary record. A phrase that should have set off every alarm in the building, because anyone who had ever dug into Derek Slade's actual record knew that phrase was not just inaccurate. It was a lie designed to protect something far bigger than one officer on the steps of one building. And somewhere in a locked cabinet on 5th Street, Maya Ellison had the proof. But she was still in a holding cell. Her foundation's lawyer was still in a waiting room being given the runaround. And Derek Slade was, at that very moment, making a phone call that would turn out to be the single greatest mistake of his professional life. He called the wrong person to warn. At 9:14 that night, a woman named Sandra Keel walked into the offices of the Harmon County Gazette and asked to speak to the editor. Sandra Keel was 61 years old. She had worked as a civilian records clerk in the Harmon County Police Department for 22 years before quietly retiring 18 months ago. She had a manila folder tucked under her arm. She set it on the editor's desk without saying a word about what was inside. The editor opened it. What she found was a complaint, filed 8 years ago by a woman named Denise Carter, who had accused Derek Slade of unlawful detention and racial targeting during a routine traffic stop. The complaint was detailed. It included witness names, badge numbers, precise timestamps, and a written account that was so specific and so consistent with the video from this afternoon that it made the editor sit back in her chair and go completely still. The complaint had been formally received by the department. It had been assigned a case number, and then it had simply stopped. No investigation, no finding, no closure, just a number on a form that led nowhere, like a door that had been quietly bricked over from the inside. But that wasn't even the most important thing in the folder. Tucked behind the Denise Carter complaint was a printed email chain. Internal. Department letterhead. Dated 6 years ago. It was a thread between Captain Alan Forsyth and a deputy administrator at the state's police oversight board, a man named Richard Coles, discussing, in language that was careful but unmistakable, how to manage the optics of a cluster of related complaints filed against Officer Slade that year. How to keep the folder light. How to ensure that a certain personnel file reflected service, not controversy. Sandra Keel had kept copies. For years, she had kept copies. She had been waiting, as she told the editor that night, for the moment when not saying anything would cost more than saying something. That moment, she decided, was now. The editor called her senior reporter at 9:37. The senior reporter called the Foundation's lawyer at 9:52. The lawyer stood up from the waiting room chair where she'd been sitting for 3 hours and walked to the front desk and placed a printed document flat on the counter. "My client," she said, "will be released within the next 20 minutes, or this document, which is a formal complaint detailing the department's pattern of evidence suppression going back 9 years, gets filed with the State Attorney General's office tonight." The desk officer looked at the document. Then he picked up a phone. Maya Ellison walked out of that precinct at 10:17 in the evening. She stepped into the cool night air. Her lawyer was beside her. A small cluster of supporters had gathered at the bottom of the steps. Phones came up. Someone started clapping. Maya didn't speak. She looked at the building she'd just walked out of for a long moment. Then she looked at her lawyer. "Is the folder safe?" she said. Her lawyer nodded. "Every copy." Maya took a quiet breath. "Good," she said. "Then we begin." But what exactly was in that folder, and how far up did the chain of protection actually reach? The next morning, the Gazette ran a front-page story. By 10 a.m., it had been picked up by every major outlet in the state. By noon, it had gone national. The headline wasn't about the arrest. The headline was about the complaint file, about Sandra Keel, about the buried record of Denise Carter and at least 6 other women, all of them black, all of them between the ages of 28 and 55, all of them detained by Derek Slade in encounters that followed the same pattern with almost mechanical precision. The department released a statement saying they were reviewing all relevant materials. Richard Coles, the oversight board administrator named in the emails, said he had no memory of the correspondence. Captain Forsyth didn't release a statement at all. His office phone went to voicemail. His department email auto-replied. But the story was just getting started. By 2 in the afternoon, the Foundation's legal team had formally submitted a public records request for Derek Slade's complete personnel file. Not the version the union had cited, but the actual file, including every complaint received, every internal review opened, and every disposition recorded. Under state law, they had the right. The department had 48 hours to comply. They didn't wait 48 hours. Because 6 hours after the records request was submitted, someone inside the department, someone whose name has still not been made public, anonymously forwarded a 340-page internal document to 3 separate journalists simultaneously. It was titled, simply, Complaint Consolidation Review, Slade, D. 340 pages, covering 11 years, 14 formal complaints, not 6, 14, and the overwhelming majority of them had been quietly redirected, delayed, lost in reassignment, or closed without investigation within 60 days of being filed. In the margins of several complaint summaries, written in blue pen in a handwriting that 2 former department employees would later confirm belonged to Captain Forsyth, were single-word notations. Words like handled, words like cleared, words like NFA, no further action. The Foundation's legal team cross-referenced the dates. Of the 14 complaints against Slade, 9 had been filed during a period when Richard Coles was serving on the Oversight Board's Disciplinary Review Subcommittee, the same subcommittee responsible for approving, or in this case, quietly not approving, escalated investigations. That wasn't a pattern. That was a system. And then came the detail that made everything else click into place. The Ellison Foundation had been trying for 4 years to obtain a specific set of Oversight Board meeting minutes from a closed session held in the spring 8 years ago. The request had been denied twice on procedural grounds. The appeal had been pending for 14 months. On the morning after the arrest, those minutes were delivered to the Foundation's legal office, unsolicited, in a plain brown envelope with a Harmon County postmark. Inside was 17 pages of sealed meeting transcript. And on page 9, clearly recorded in the official minutes, was a motion put forward by Richard Coles to classify a cluster of misconduct complaints, specifically described as racially patterned detentions, as an administrative matter rather than a disciplinary one. The motion had passed 4-1. One board member had voted against it. Her name was listed in the minutes. She had quietly resigned from the board 3 months later. The Foundation had been looking for her for 2 years. She called them that afternoon. Her name was Councilwoman Joan Merritt. She was now a sitting member of the state legislature. And she had been waiting, she told the Foundation's director, for someone to finally pull that thread all the way through. How far up did this go? And who was the one person in the state with the power to end it? By the second morning, the story had broken completely open. Councilwoman Joan Merritt held a press conference on the steps of the state legislature building. She was composed, precise, and merciless. She described the closed session vote in detail. She named Richard Coles. She named the motion. She named every board member who had voted for it. She produced her own notes from that meeting, which she had kept in a personal file for 8 years, waiting for exactly this moment. The cameras didn't look away. Online, Denise Carter, the woman whose complaint had been buried 8 years ago, released a video statement from her living room. She was soft-spoken and steady, and she described her encounter with Derek Slade with the quiet clarity of someone who had been telling the truth for so long it had become a kind of armor. The video got 4 million views in 6 hours. Then came the moment that tipped it all. The body camera footage was released. Not by the department, they were still reviewing it. It was released by a junior officer who had been present on the Civic Center steps that afternoon, who had gone home that night, watched the videos on his phone, pulled up the body cam file on his department login, and made a decision that he later said was the clearest decision he'd ever made in his professional life. The footage showed everything. It showed Maya standing still and cooperative. It showed Slade approaching her without cause, without question, without a single attempt at dialogue. It showed him reaching for the cuffs before he had said one word to her. It showed him whispering in her ear. The audio was partially degraded, but the lip-reading experts brought in by 3 separate outlets all read the same words. It showed everything. And it showed one more thing that nobody had mentioned yet, because nobody had noticed it until that moment. In the upper left corner of the frame, partially out of view, there was a figure in a gray suit standing near the building's entrance. He was on a phone. His face was visible for exactly 4 seconds. His name was later confirmed by 2 separate sources. It was Richard Coles. He had been there. On those steps, he had watched Derek Slade make the arrest. And then he had immediately walked back inside the building and made a call. Have you ever watched someone abuse power in real time and felt completely helpless to stop it? Have you ever wondered what it takes for the truth to finally break through? The answer, it turned out, was 15 years of quiet, patient, documented preparation. And the phone call that changed everything was about to happen. At 2:44 in the afternoon on the second day, the governor's phone rang. He had already been briefed. His staff had been tracking the story since the first night. But what he heard on that call, from his own director of public safety, who had spent the last 12 hours reviewing the 340-page document, the board minutes, and the body cam footage, made him go very quiet for a very long time. Then he asked his assistant to connect him to a number his office had on file. A direct number. One that his predecessor had placed in the state's official contact directory 4 years ago, after the Ellison Foundation had helped the state secure a landmark federal health grant. The phone rang twice. Maya picked up. "Dr. Ellison," the governor said. "Not ma'am. Not Miss Ellison. Not the woman arrested on Thursday. Her name, her title, her full dignity," offered without hesitation. "I owe you an apology on behalf of this office and this state. And I need to talk to you about what happens next." What happened next moved fast. By 4 o'clock, Derek Slade had been suspended with pay pending a full investigation, a phrase the department had clearly hoped would slow things down, but which Councilwoman Merritt immediately followed up with a formal legislative motion to convert to an unpaid suspension pending criminal review. By 5:30, Richard Coles had resigned from the Oversight Board. His resignation statement was 3 sentences long and contained no admission of wrongdoing and no acknowledgement of any person by name. His lawyer issued a separate statement that was 4 times as long and said even less. Captain Forsyth placed himself on medical leave the following morning. 2 weeks later, he would announce his retirement. The Oversight Board voted unanimously, including the 3 members who had voted for Coles's original motion 8 years ago, to reopen and formally investigate all 14 complaints against Derek Slade, as well as to conduct a full audit of complaint handling practices going back a decade. And then came the moment nobody had predicted. On the 3rd evening, the governor appeared at a press conference. He stood at the podium in the Harmon County Civic Center, the exact building where it had all begun, and read from a prepared statement. He called the arrest unlawful. He called the suppression of complaints a failure of institutional accountability. He announced the creation of an independent state commission to review Oversight Board practices statewide. He named the commission, and then he looked up from the paper. He stepped slightly away from the podium, and without any notes, he said, "I want to be clear about something. What changed this week was not a political decision. What changed this week was that someone had been building the truth, carefully and meticulously, for 15 years, and the weight of that truth finally became impossible to hide. We are here tonight because of the work of Dr. Maya Ellison, and this state is better for her persistence." In the front row, Maya sat with her legal team and the foundation staff around her. She did not cry. She did not stand up or raise her fist or give a speech. She nodded once, very slowly, the way someone nods when they hear a thing they already knew out loud for the very first time. But there was one more thing. One final detail that the cameras caught and nobody expected. In the back of that same room, seated in the last row, wearing a dark coat and keeping very still, was Denise Carter, the woman whose complaint had started the file, whose name had been buried on a form for 8 years. She wasn't on the program. Nobody had announced her. She had simply come. When the press conference ended and the room started moving, Maya walked the entire length of the hall. She stopped in front of Denise. She took her hands. She said 2 words. "I know." And Denise Carter, who had kept the truth alive for 8 years in the face of a system that had done everything it could to make her feel like she hadn't seen what she had seen, Denise Carter let herself cry. In the months that followed, the changes came steadily, the way real changes always do. Not in a single dramatic rush, but in the accumulating weight of one decision after another. Derek Slade was formally charged with civil rights violations and misconduct under color of law. He pleaded not guilty and his trial was set for the following spring. 3 of the women who had filed original complaints, including Denise Carter, were named as witnesses. Their accounts, ignored for years, buried under procedure and protected by silence, were now the centerpiece of a federal civil rights case that drew national attention. Richard Coles settled a civil complaint with the state for an amount that was not disclosed, but that required him to formally acknowledge the existence and suppression of the complaint files. He did not work in public administration again. The Ellison Foundation received a federal grant to expand its complaint documentation program to 4 additional states. The waiting list for their legal support services grew by 800% in 6 months. And Sandra Keel, the retired records clerk who had carried that manila folder for years, waiting for the right moment, was invited to speak at a national conference on whistleblower protections. She showed up in a green blazer, set her notes on the podium, looked out at the audience and said, "I kept the copies because I believed the day would come when they would matter. What I didn't know was how long I would have to wait. What I know now is that waiting with evidence is not the same as doing nothing. Maya returned to the Civic Center 3 months after the arrest. This time, she walked up those marble steps alone. No cameras followed her. No crowd gathered. She stood at the top of those steps in the morning quiet, looked out at the empty plaza below, and stood there for a while. And what she felt, by her own account in an interview she gave 6 months later, was not triumph. It wasn't even relief exactly. It was something harder to name. It was the feeling of a person who has spent a very long time carrying something heavy, and has finally been allowed to set it down. Do you believe justice always wins? Because here is what this story actually teaches, when you strip everything else away. Justice doesn't always arrive on schedule. It doesn't always show up when you need it most. It doesn't always announce itself or protect you in the moment or prevent the handcuffs from clicking shut. But it can arrive. It does arrive when someone refuses to let the evidence disappear. When someone has the patience to build a truth too heavy to keep buried. When someone understands that dignity is not something that can be taken by a pair of handcuffs, no matter how publicly, no matter how deliberately, no matter how many cameras are watching. Maya Ellison was arrested in front of 300 people. She walked out of that police station the same night. She stood before that same crowd 72 hours later. Not in handcuffs, not in silence, but in history. She did not become powerful after the arrest. She was already powerful. The arrest simply showed the world what she had spent 15 years quietly becoming. The most dangerous person you can humiliate in public is someone who has quietly earned the power to make the truth undeniable. And the most important thing you can do, in your own life, in your own quiet corner of this complicated world, is never stop building that power. Not through noise, not through rage, but through evidence, through patience, through the unshakable conviction that the truth, properly documented and patiently carried, will one day be too heavy for even the most powerful system to keep buried. Because the day always comes. The moment always arrives. And when it does, what